Welcome to our class on global Anglicanism. No one can accurately predict where Anglicanism is headed in the future. Not even Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay, God can, but we can't. On the other hand, we mortals can come to understand something about the recent history of Anglicanism, and through that, we can be able to see more clearly which direction the Church is likely to be headed in the future. The concept of Anglican identity, or identities, has been of considerable interest in recent times. Rowan Williams has written a book about it, as you all know, and so have a number of other scholars and church figures. Some of these have been included in this week's handouts. Has any consensus emerged from these inquiries? Is Anglicanism just another word for the Church of England located somewhere outside England, but with all the same historical, cultural, linguistic, theological, governance, and experiential assumptions and practices? Or is it something entirely different? And who determines this? That is, who will determine the nature of Anglican identity now and in the future? Will it be the Church of England, the historic home of Anglicanism? Will it be the American Episcopal Church, with its vast financial resources but shrinking membership? Or the emerging Anglican Church in the developing world, with its vibrant Christianity, strong leadership in growing numbers, but scarce resources? Traditionally, in church history, denominational identity is rooted in similarity, or doctrinal and experiential conformity. Sometimes denominational identity is expressed in a common history or story. At still other times, it can be lodged in ethnic or nationalistic or linguistic distinctiveness. So, how does Anglican identity fit into these various patterns? With the exception of Roman Catholicism, no church on earth is more geographically, ethnically, and racially diverse than the Anglican Communion. And no church on earth, including the Roman Catholic Church, embraces more theological diversity than Anglicanism. So, how can a common spiritual identity emerge from such diverse circumstances? The conception of a spiritual identity in the Anglican Church that transcended England, or Englishness, or the Church of England, or even Great Britain, began to emerge during the early 19th century. This something, of course, coincided with the emergence of the worldwide British Empire, with new ways of thinking about Englishness, and with the rapid expansion and diversity of the Anglican Church. During this period, English culture, language, religion, and people, in vast numbers, were all being exported throughout many parts of the world. Thus, this ancient and tiny island nation was, for the first time in its long history, assuming a preeminent place in world leadership, with virtually no economic, cultural, military, or religious rivals in sight. The Church of Rome, just by way of noting, was settling very little new territory during the 19th century. A momentous event such as this must naturally spark off a new and perhaps very different way of thinking about Anglican identity. This was certainly true in England during the 19th century. Out of this process of reconsideration, this new thinking, a new sense of national religious identity began to emerge, the concept of Anglicanism. Significantly, the first recorded use of the term Anglicanism was in a newspaper article in 1829, in reference to English, as opposed to Irish, Scottish, or Welsh, economic and political interest. A few years later, in 1836, the term Anglicanism was first used to describe a new religious identity. That identity included, but also transcended, the Church of England. More significantly, in 1838, John Henry Newman used the term Anglican to describe for the first time the doctrines and practices of the Church of England, implying its doctrinal continuity from the ancient Anglo-Saxon and Celtic churches to the Roman Catholic Church, and eventually to a Reformed Catholic Church that was now being exported throughout much of the world. Thus, Anglican identity is a national religion of the English, but also is something that, like the English language, held worldwide appeal and significance, was given a title apart from the troublesome one, at least to overseas Anglicans, of the Church of England. But what was the nature, the identity of this church that understood itself to be, at the same time, both ancient and new, Catholic and Protestant, English and worldwide, connected and independent, orthodox and comprehensive? And where was there to be found some form of central authority that was enforceable, yet compatible with the rights of the independent churches that made up the Anglican Communion? During the 20th century, the arrangement of the three traditional parties in the Church, liberal, evangelical, and Anglo-Catholic, remain largely unchanged, though their names may have been modified somewhat. For example, Broad Church was now changed to liberal, or sometimes to liberal Catholic. The relative strength and influence of each party continued to ebb and flow, however, with the liberals holding preeminence in appointments to high office, such as archbishop, bishop, dean, archdeacon, canon, etc. The justification for this being that these men were better able to avoid ecclesial extremes and represent the nation as a whole, or the so-called man in the pew. For example, of the 9 men who served as Archbishop of Canterbury during the 20th century, 6 were liberals, or establishment men, as they are sometimes called. 2 were evangelicals, Donald Coggan and George Carey, and 1 was an Anglo-Catholic, Michael Ramsey. Against this outlook is the argument that moderate evangelicals and Anglo-Catholics were equally able to represent the church as a whole, and that the church membership was more or less equally divided between the parties. So, the argument went, the appointment of so many liberals to high office in the church was unfair, unrepresentative, un-Anglican. Since the 1970s, evangelicals in the Church of England have become much more prominent, numerically, financially, and in other ways, leading to increased calls that they have not been fairly represented in church leadership. This has been answered in part by the appointment of the 2 evangelical archbishops, Coggan and Carey, since that time, as well as by the appointment of the current archbishop, Justin Welby, who's an evangelical, in 2013. Even more significant for the church has been the rise of a number of large and influential evangelical parish churches, such as, in London, All Souls Langham Place, on the left here, where John Stott was the rector for many years, St. Helens Bishopgate, which is in the City of London, or the financial district, which you can see from the building behind it, here pictured in the center, and which is the bastion of conservative Anglican evangelicalism, and Holy Trinity Brompton on the right here, which is a kind of soft, charismatic, home of soft, charismatic evangelicalism, I guess. And in addition to these, there's been countless other parish churches of a large evangelical nature throughout England. These churches have defied the modern notion of secularism and shrinking churches, and they have planted numerous new churches, especially in London, and they've provided untold initiatives leading to the revitalization of the spiritual life of the church, the Alpha Course being perhaps just one example of this. A fascinating, albeit a detailed and lengthy account of these changes in the Diocese of London has been produced by Richard Shardis, the Bishop of London, who has made much of this possible through his exemplary leadership. This document is entitled Church Growth in the Capital, and it's included in last week's handouts. if you really want to know what's going on, at least in the Diocese of London, this is an excellent recap of it. It'll be a document that I think will be much looked at by church historians in the future. Now, all that is not to say that the Church of England has been exempted from the various pressures and difficulties experienced by other churches in England, or indeed throughout the Anglican world. Reduced attendance and revenues remain problematic. Institutional morale is often low. Clergy are underpaid and, not infrequently, poorly housed. Disputes over women's ordination during the 1980s and 90s were prolonged and difficult, leading to despair and not a few defections to Rome. Likewise, the more recent deliberations over women's bishops. Questions about sexuality and the nature of marriage have been highly polarizing and remain unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable. Of course, at the heart of these disputes and disagreements lies the wider issue of authority in the Church of England, and in Anglicanism itself more broadly. The Church of England remains an established church, and therefore subject to royal, that is, parliamentary governance. But the General Synod of the Church of England, which meets twice a year, is its real governing force, while the two archbishops, Canterbury and York, and the diocesan bishops have influence, but little real power. The Synod is divided into three houses: bishops, clergy, and laity, with each house, in theory, holding equal power. Passage of major legislation, such as women's ordination, requires a 2/3 majority in all three houses. Hence, the Synod often moves slowly and deliberately, often to the frustration of progressives. Most women in the Church, or the nation as a whole, most people in the Church, or the nation as a whole, show little interest in the political affairs of the Church, except, of course, when there is a major scandal or disagreement. Probably the most significant dispute of the 20th century involved the long debate over women's ordination, or, more specifically, the question of women being ordained to the priesthood. The debate goes back to the 1960s, or perhaps even earlier. In 1975, the General Synod passed a motion that read, quote, that this synod considers that there are no fundamental objections to the ordination of women to the priesthood. A similar motion asking for legislation to be prepared in Parliament to remove all obstacles to women's ordination did not pass the General Synod. 3 years later, however, it did pass. In 1981, women were allowed to become deacons in the Church of England. On 11th of November 1992, and after much debate, the General Synod approved a proposal to allow women to be ordained to the priesthood. This proved highly controversial in the Church, opposed by Anglo-Catholics who objected that the Church of England was acting unilaterally or non-ecumenically, and by some evangelicals who objected to the notion of the authority of women in the Church. The Synod also approved a measure to provide financial compensation to those members of the clergy who could no longer remain in the Church. 2 years later, the first women were ordained. Reportedly, more than 500 clergy seceded from the Church of England, mostly to the Church of Rome, although some simply to secular positions, as a direct result of the ordination of women to the priesthood. In 2014, the General Synod approved the consecration of women to the episcopate, with the first woman being consecrated as bishop in the following year. This also proved controversial, though with a diminished Anglo-Catholic presence in the Church, less so than the debates over the ordination of women to the priesthood back in the 1980s and 90s. Numerous other controversial issues have rocked the Church of England during the 20th century. Two of the most heated were, first of all, the debate over publication of the book Honest to God by the Right Reverend A.T. Robinson, the Bishop of Woolwich, which was published in 1963. The book proved highly controversial, not least because of its denial of God's transcendence, its support of continuing revelation that emerges from culture, not scripture, tradition, or reason, and its approval of so-called situational ethics. That Robinson was a bishop of the church only added to the firestorm surrounding the book's publication. One outspoken critic of the book was C.S. Lewis, who, when asked, "What do you think of the controversial new book, Honest to God?" replied, rather dryly, "I prefer being honest to being honest to God." In 1984, David Jenkins, professor of theology at the University of Leeds in the north of England, was appointed Bishop of Durham. This proved highly controversial due to Jenkins' outspoken liberalism, which supposedly included such teachings as the denial of Jesus' resurrection. 3 days after his consecration in York Minster, the building was struck by lightning, an event that not a few interpreted as a display of God's displeasure, though one wonders why God waited 3 days to express such concern. The Church of England produced a number of important and influential leaders during the 20th century, including William Temple, who was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1942 to 1944. Uniquely, Temple's father, Frederick Temple, was also Archbishop of Canterbury. Through this connection and many others, he was considered the ultimate late Victorian or Edwardian insider or establishment figure, the so-called Golden Boy, who, as the well-known Catholic writer Ronnie Knox described him, could do, quote, nothing wrong. Temple was a philosopher by training and by inclination. He was the leading light of the Liberal Party in the Church during the 20th century, and was principally interested in faith and the social order. Popular, engaging, and erudite, the short nature of his archiepiscopate, only 2 years, and his early death shattered his many admirers, both inside and outside the church. Temple, however, made little lasting theological contribution to the life of the church. His principal contributions came through his efforts to bring faith to bear on a host of serious and dynamic social problems of his day, of which his active mind was much interested. His publication, Christianity and the Social Order, published in 1942, is still much admired. When William Temple died, prematurely, in the midst of the Second World War, most observers knew instinctively who should succeed him. George Bell had been Bishop of Chichester on the south coast of England since 1929. A liberal Catholic churchman, he became the leading Anglican spokesman on ecumenical relations, at a time when such relations were very important. Through this work, he met and became close friends with the young German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Through Bonhoeffer, Bell became a conduit for valuable information being passed from the German underground to the British government. Bell was also an outspoken supporter of the German confessing church movement, of which Bonhoeffer was involved. When the RAF and the American Air Force, or American Army Air Corps as it was called then, began saturation bombing of German cities during the war, Bell spoke out sharply against the practice in the House of Lords. This brought considerable public criticism on his head and controversy, and probably cost him the elevation to Canterbury when Temple died in 1944, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister, being particularly critical of Bell's criticism of saturation bombing policy. Recently, Bell has been the subject of a rather mysterious charge of sexually abusing a girl while bishop. An investigation into the case resulted in a payment being made to the victim, but no information on the case has been made public. As Bell is one of the most revered figures in modern Anglican church history, however, and as the charge seems entirely out of character, many have questioned the probity of the case and are pushing for the details to be made public. But as of today, nothing has. Geoffrey Fisher was chosen instead of Bell to succeed Temple at Canterbury. At the time, he was serving as Bishop of London. Another liberal churchman, he was also interested in ecumenical affairs, and in 1960, he was the first Archbishop of Canterbury since the Reformation to meet the ecumenical patriarch, and the first to meet the Pope since 1397. Fisher's term as Archbishop coincided with the decolonization of much of the British Empire. As such, he presided over the establishment of a number of new provinces in former colonial areas. Michael Ramsay was probably the most influential Archbishop of Canterbury since the Second World War. A talented theologian, he was from the Anglo-Catholic tradition of the Church. While Archbishop, he was extensively involved in ecumenical affairs and in social questions. His contributions to Anglican spirituality are particularly remembered. His book, The Gospel in the Catholic Church, published in 1936, remains greatly admired and read. Donald Coggan was the first evangelical Archbishop of Canterbury since John Bird Sumner in the middle of the 19th century. His archiepiscopate was noted for its strong support for the ordination of women and for a number of evangelical causes, such as missionary efforts both at home and abroad. Robert Runcie was probably the most controversial Archbishop of Canterbury in modern times. He was from the liberal tradition of the Church. Personable and popular, he was a penetrating thinker. Interested in a variety of social issues, he clashed repeatedly with the conservative government of Margaret Thatcher. Runcie presided over the issuing of the Faith in the City report in 1985, which led the Church of England to reallocate much of its focus, including its clergy, from its traditional strength in the countryside to the intercity urban areas of England. Late in life, a fierce controversy broke out between Runcie and Humphrey Carpenter, the biographer, who published an authorized biography of Runcie that contained a number of confidential remarks that Runcie had made in the course of Carpenter's interviews, but which Runcie assumed would not be published, and Carpenter assumed would be. George Carey was the third evangelical Archbishop of Canterbury, and the first modern Archbishop not to have attended either Oxford or Cambridge universities. Like most evangelicals, he was a firm supporter of the ordination of women, and the first ordination of women in the Church of England occurred during his time in office. He also presided over the 1998 Lambeth Conference, with its heated debates over sexuality. Carey was outspoken on many issues during his time as Archbishop, and has become even more so in retirement. Widely known to dislike his successor and his views, there has been much publicity over his public positions on a host of issues in recent times. Rowan Williams was Archbishop of Canterbury from 2003 to 2013. He is of liberal Catholic churchmanship. Many intellectuals rejoiced at his elevation to Canterbury, for he was widely regarded as a man who could make Christianity credible to those inside and outside the faith, and especially to intelligent people. Williams is a noted theologian and scholar, an erudite speaker, and, during his archiepiscopate, a lightning rod of much controversy. He worked hard to try to hold the Anglican communion together during a difficult time. His own reserve and cautious temperament has also led to misunderstanding, however, and to various administrative or leadership failures in trying to bring together opposing factions in the Church. Justin Welby became Archbishop of Canterbury in 2013 in succession to Rowan Williams. His background could hardly have been different than Williams, who was really a scholar from an early age and came up through Oxford and Cambridge and then through various professorships, and then had a brief ministry in the church before being appointed Bishop of Monmouth. in Wales, which is a rather small, obscure diocese, and then becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, basically on the reputation of his writings, his theological writings, and his speeches that he gives and talks and things. Justin Welby, on the other hand, was a businessman. He spent a lot of time working in the oil industry in west of Africa, and mostly in Nigeria, I think, where he became a born-again Christian. He had an evangelical conversion experience in the Anglican tradition and has since left the oil industry and then sought ordination in the Church of England. And his ministry in the Church of England has been fairly brief, like Williams's, but completely different. He's not a scholar. He did go to Cambridge, but he's not really a scholar. He's one who focuses his ministry on peace and reconciliation. And much of his work in the church prior to his being elevated to the episcopate and the archiepiscopate has been in reconciliation work and closely tied to the reconciliation ministry in the Diocese of Coventry, in Coventry Cathedral itself, in the middle part of England. As you know, Coventry Cathedral was destroyed by the war, by the German bombing, and when the cathedral was rebuilt, they left the ruins of the old cathedral right next to it, and it's been a great center of reconciliation studies for a long time. And Justin Welby has been at the center of that for the last few decades. After some years of doing that, he was appointed Bishop of Durham, but he only lasted a year at that when he was appointed to Archbishop of Canterbury, which is an amazing kind of rapid elevation in the church. And so far, his work, I think, has been much admired. He is in an impossible position, as I think all archbishops are right now, in the sense of trying to hold together different factions, often very strongly opposed factions. But again, his work in reconciliation, his background in that, I think, has served him well. One interesting aspect of his life that's been in the news recently has been the discovery of his true genetic father. He comes from a rather unfortunate family background. His parents were estranged or divorced, and he knew his mother, and he knew who he thought was his father. Well, it turns out the man he thought was his father wasn't his father at all, and many people have been suggesting that to him for a long time. But when he finally got down to doing DNA testing, he discovered that someone who he never knew was really his father. And it's interesting, the way he's handled this has been full of tremendous sense of grace and acceptance and even sense of humor about it and peace about it. And this has really impressed a lot of people in England and throughout the world. He's obviously a man of deep and abiding Christian spirituality, great faith, but also a man that seems to be at peace with himself and at peace with the impossible job or position that he's been appointed to. We can certainly all keep him in our prayers. During most of the 19th century, denominational warfare in England was the order of the day. The Church of England guarded its privileges and monopolies with political skill and diligence, if not always much success, while the growing number of nonconformists grew increasingly demanding with the passage of each new decade. This tense atmosphere began to change towards the end of the 19th century. Why? Well, first of all, dissenting grievances began to be satisfied, placing Anglicans and nonconformists on a more level playing field. This change began to ease long-standing tensions and animosities between the members of the Church of England and those of other churches. Secondly, increased immigration, especially that of Irish Roman Catholics into England. Third, class distinctions, which served as a source of religious division. These were increasingly felt to be less important after the First World War. Finally, increasing secularism and growing skepticism or atheism began to erode Christianity's long-standing hegemony in English society. After 1919, church attendance dropped considerably. In short, the churches simply no longer enjoyed the privilege of carrying on their lofty disagreements with one another or with the state amid a new national atmosphere of secularism and spiritual indifference. During the 20th century, there were 9 Lambeth conferences. The First World War delayed the start of the 6th conference, while the Eighth Conference was pushed back from 1940 to 1948. The 1908 conference was concerned principally with reconciling theology and modern thought. 242 bishops attended. 79 of these were from the Church of England, and 89 were from the developing world, or the colonial areas of the British Empire. The 1948 conference stated its opposition to the ordination of Florence Lee Timwee to the priesthood in wartime Hong Kong. Her ordination occurred in 1944 during extraordinary circumstances when there were simply no men available to serve as priests, but there were Christians who needed priests and needed people to celebrate the Eucharist and so forth. After the war, of course, this became very controversial, and so in order to dampen down the controversy, she voluntarily relinquished her license to officiate as a priest, although she never gave up resigned her ordination to the priesthood. The 1968 Lambeth Conference recommended that women be ordained to the diaconate. It also characterized arguments for and against women's ordination to the priesthood as, quote, inconclusive. Finally, it moved that assent to the 39 articles was no longer required of the clergy. The 1998 Lambeth Conference was a historical gathering because it was the first time that bishops from the Global South dominated the discussions and voting. It was also perhaps the first conference at which women bishops had attended. Among the controversies surrounding the conference, Resolution 1.10 on human sexuality proved particularly contentious. It upheld faithfulness in marriage between a man and a woman in lifelong union and declared that abstinence is right for those who were not called to marriage. It rejected homosexual practice as incompatible with Scripture, and it declared that it could not advise the legitimizing or blessing of same-sex unions, nor the ordaining of those involved in same-gender unions. The 2008 Lambeth Conference also proved controversial. 880 primates and bishops were invited, and around 650 attended. Gene Robinson, Bishop of the Diocese of New Hampshire in the Episcopal Church, Martin Mims, the former rector of Truro Episcopal Church in Northern Virginia, but now Bishop of the Convocation of Anglicans in North America, or CANA as it was known, and bishops from many of the continuing Anglican churches throughout the world were not invited. 4 primates, Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, and Rwanda, and a number of bishops boycotted the conference in protest to the invitation of bishops from the Episcopal Church in the United States. The conference was presided over by Rowan Williams, and the emphasis was on training for really effective, truthful, and prayerful mission, as Williams expressed it. Resolution 110 on human sexuality was not reopened, though a listening process in which diverse views and experience of the subject did take place. Overshadowing the 2008 Lambeth Conference was the initial Global Anglican Future Conference, or GAFCON as it was called, which was held in Jerusalem over a 7-day period in June 2008, just 2 weeks before the start of the Lambeth Conference. It was attended by 291 bishops and by 1,148 lay and clergy delegates, and was regarded by not a few in the Church as an alternative Lambeth Conference. Sessions were held on secularism, the Anglican Communion, HIV, AIDS, and poverty. It called for the creation of the Anglican Church in North America as an alternative to the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church in Canada. Significantly, it declared that recognition by the Archbishop of Canterbury is not necessary to Anglican identity. 2 documents were issued, a GAFCON statement and a Jerusalem Declaration. The later, the Jerusalem Declaration, established the Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans and sent out the basis of Orthodox Anglican belief. Over the years, the Lambeth Conferences have demonstrated that the bishops of disparate churches could manifest at least some level of unity in their episcopal collegiality, despite the absence of a clear sense of authority. The conferences have also served as the first of what are now referred to as the instruments of communion. These are the three gatherings of Anglicans that include the Anglican Consultative Council and the Primates Meeting. Those attending the 1968 Lambeth Conferences determined the need for more frequent and more representative contact among the leaders of the Anglican churches throughout the world, more than was possible through a single conference of bishops held every 10 years. Consequently, the constitution of an Anglican Consultative Council, or ACC, was proposed and voted on favorably by all of the provinces of the Anglican Communion. The work of the ACC began in October of 1969. It is the only one of the three instruments of communion that includes the participation of laity, priests, and deacons. In 1978, Archbishop Donald Coggan identified the need for, as he called it, a time for, quote, leisurely thought, prayer, and deep consultation. Out of this was born the informal Primates Meeting, which has held regular meetings ever since. Viewpoints and opinions vary over the extent to which global Anglicanism has escaped its deep roots in Englishness and established its own separate identity. No doubt qualities of Englishness, such as reserve, moderation, and compromise, have seriously influenced the nature of the Anglican Church throughout its history. How could it not? But to what extent have such qualities remained, and what are their continuing influence in global Anglicanism? The largest Anglican province in the world is now the Church of Nigeria, followed by the Church of Uganda. Both churches have their own unique histories, which are, on the one hand, closely tied to their colonial relations with Britain, but on the other hand, are singular and tied to their African locations and cultures, their close proximities to large Muslim populations, and, especially in Uganda, to martyrdom. In the United States, the Episcopal Church has had a very different history and identity. At its inception, it had to establish an identity opposed to Englishness if it was to survive the American Revolution. That is, it needed, and very quickly, to convince Americans that it could stand in succession to, but entirely independent of, the Church of England. As a component of that, it was greatly influenced by the American tradition of religious freedom, or the absence of an established church, and its replacement by the concept of a free market in religion, or so-called free trade in religion. In some ways, this concept has served the Episcopal Church well, but in others, it has left the Church vulnerable to the need to follow closely the latest cultural trends in America, and to sanction those trends as consistent with the teachings of the gospel, whether or not such sanction met with the approval of any other part of the Anglican Communion or of the wider Church itself. Without question, there is much goodwill in the Anglican Communion to remain close as a body and to uphold the principles on which Anglicanism has emerged in its history to become the third largest Christian tradition in the world. At the same time, there are serious divisions of the Anglican Communion that may ultimately destroy what is left of that goodwill and of that resolution to remain one single communion. What are the possible solutions or alternatives? There are at least three. First of all, things may go along as they have for the past decade or so, with an impaired fellowship and with little hope for improvement in the short run. The primates of the Global South will continue to invest in alternative instruments of communion that will largely, but not officially, carry on without the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lambeth Conferences, the ACC, and the Primates meetings. Secondly, there will be a formal split between the Global South Primates and those of the rest of the Anglican Communion and their churches. This separation could be short or long-term in nature. Third, there could be a reordering of the Anglican Communion, where the Episcopal Church, along with perhaps a few other churches, is excluded or withdraws voluntarily from the instruments of communion. Presumably, such action would restore the Global South Primates and their churches to the full life of the communion, and perhaps open the way for the inclusion of the primates of the Anglican Church in North America and those of a number of continuing Anglican churches throughout the world to be incorporated into the life of the communion. In any case, there is no reason to suspect that Anglicanism will not continue to thrive, at least in those parts of the world where modernism has not come to dominate the prevailing religious culture, and to offer a vibrant alternative, a middle way between the extremes represented, alternatively, by Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, but, more significantly, between those influenced by a modern form of Christianity and those who adhere to a Christianity in its more traditional approach.